What's interesting about Pepsi is that its profit margin is half of Coke. And by the way, I have a secret photo inside a Pepsi facility that nobody else has seen inside this video. In addition, in this video, I'm going to introduce you to an amazing woman. My name is Andrew Stotz. Let's get started with this case study on PepsiCo. The company owns 23 brands. It's beverages and food and snacks, and it's available in more than 200 countries worldwide. If we compare Coke versus Pepsi, we can see that the market share in the US is 44% Coke, 24% Pepsi. So Pepsi's at almost half market share. Let's look at revenue. Global revenue for Coca-Cola is $43 billion, but for Pepsi, it's basically double at 86. How can that be? Well, that's because 60% of revenue comes from something that Coca-Cola doesn't even have, food and snacks. And then another 40% of revenue comes from beverages. This is a very different strategy from what Coke is doing. Coke is focused on one product area, whereas Pepsi's got snacks and beverages. What's the most valuable brand in beverage for Pepsi? Well, it's Pepsi, followed by Mountain Dew. And what's the most valuable brand in its food slate? Lay's and Doritos. Who doesn't like those? Here's some recent Pepsi innovation where they came up with a new 2-liter bottle, which after 30 years of the 1-liter bottle, they redesigned it to make it easier to pour and easier to hold. They, in fact, have a patent on it, which I was just reading through. One of the things that people don't realize if they haven't worked in companies like Pepsi or Coke is that the bottle has to be structurally strong because you're stacking bottles quite high. So Pepsi was founded in 1893 in North Carolina and by pharmacist Caleb Brandom. And I want to introduce you to Indra Nooyi. And she joined PepsiCo in 1994, and from 1996 until 2000 was Senior Vice President for Corporate Strategy and Development. And Indra was President and Chief Financial Officer from 2001 and CEO from 2006 to 2018. She was Chairwoman from 2007 until 2019. Do you call it chairman, chairperson, chairwoman? What do you call it? I remember a friend of mine in Thailand presented me with her business card, and she said, I am chairperson. And I thought to myself, why does she have to call herself person? Why not woman, chairwoman? That's what I would call it. But what do you think? Let's hear what Indra said about fear as a motivation.
Do you think a woman today has it easier than when you became CEO, or do you still feel that you still have to work harder to be a woman CEO than, let's say, a man who is a CEO of an equivalent-sized company?
I think easier today only because there are few more of us in positions of power. But I think from a personal perspective, it's got nothing to do with women or being in this position. I have the immigrant fear. So I'm always afraid that if I fail, I may have to go back to something that I don't want to go back to. And so that fear always motivates me, and I drive myself to be better and better and better at my job every day.
The immigrant fear. In fact, so many amazing immigrants coming from India to lead businesses in America. It's such an impressive story. My family, my father's side of the family, immigrated from Germany to America in 1839. And though I never met my great-grandfather, I'm sure between him and his father and his grandfather, they had immigrant fear. So what's the company's competitive strategy? Well, first, they've got 423,000 employees, and its main products are Pepsi, Frito-Lay, and Quaker Foods. So competitive advantages comes through a wide portfolio of products, of popular beverages, snacks, and food brands. So how did it achieve this? Well, it achieved it through strong brand recognition, diverse product offerings, and effective marketing strategies. What's different about Coke versus Pepsi is that Pepsi and Coke they're both delivering product to the similar outlets. But what Pepsi's doing is saying, hey, if we can sell potato chips along with our Pepsi to that customer, why not? We maximize our sales channel. It's a strategy. It's different from Coke, What's the latest news? Well, quarterly results show that Pepsi reported third quarter 2023 recurring EPS of about 2.24, which is up only 2% year on year and 6.9% Q on Q. The company had a gross profit margin incredibly of 54%. The 9-month full-year result was about 75.8% of the full-year forecast that I've made in this particular report. Now, sponsorships. Pepsi has sponsored so many different activities, but after a decade of sponsoring the Super Bowl halftime, Pepsi announced in 2022 that it would no longer advertise during that segment. So that was 10 years, but things have changed, and now at that time in 2022 and onward, Apple Music was in a better position. Now, I'd like to go back to Indra because she made me really laugh when I heard her talk about this one. So let's just hear what she said.
The biological clock and the career clock are in total conflict with each other. When you have to have kids, you have to build your career. Just as you're rising to middle management, your kids need you because they're teenagers, they need you for the teenage years. And as you grow even more, your parents need you because they're aging. I mean, I'll tell you a story that happened when my daughter went to Catholic school, Convent of Sacred Heart. And every Wednesday morning, they have class coffee with mothers. For a working woman, how's it going to work? How am I going to take off 9 o'clock on Wednesday mornings to go for a class coffee? So I missed most class coffees. My daughter would come home and she'd say, list of all the mothers that were there, and you were not their mom. First few times I would die with guilt, but I developed coping mechanisms. I called the school and I said, give me a list of mothers who were not there. So when she came home in the evening, she'd say, you were not there, you were not there. I said, Mrs. Rag wasn't there, Mrs. So-and-so wasn't there, so I'm not the only bad mother.
Her coping mechanism was fighting back. So let's go back. I told you I was going to give you a secret photo. Well, here it is. This is me. In the center of that picture, my first 3 years out of university was working at Pepsi. I worked at the Torrance and the Buena Park plants in Los Angeles. This was 1992, just before I was leaving Pepsi to go to live in Thailand. Pepsi was great to me. I learned a lot working with the company, but also they paid for my MBA, which I totally appreciated at the time until now. And in addition, my boss sent me to have a seminar with Dr. W. Edwards Deming. And that's how I became such a big fan of Dr. Deming's teaching in Out of the Crisis. And I became a host of the Deming Institute podcast. So I have to thank Pepsi so much. These were all the guys that I work with, and it's really great to see their smiles. So the question is, we know the competitive strategy of the company, but does this produce a competitive advantage? In other words, is the company financially world-class? So here's the method I use as an investor and business owner to measure whether a company has a competitive advantage. The world-class benchmarking scorecard that we developed 10 years ago. Here's how I construct a scorecard for any company. We gather the yearly and quarterly financial data of 26,000 companies worldwide, and then we calculate each company's profitable growth score, which is a composite of both profitability and growth. And after that, we rank the subject company relative to sector peers of a similar size. The decile ranking of 1 is best and 10 is worst. So a score of 1 or 2 is financially world-class. And then we assess the company's performance over the prior 4 years and the past 12 months. So is Pepsi financially world-class? Well, before we go into that, let's look at Coke for a moment again and remind ourselves when compared against 560 large consumer staple companies, what we see is that Coke is, in fact, financially world-class. The only time that they weren't was in 2020 during the COVID crisis, and they slipped by 1 measure. But overall, a great business. And here we can see that Coke has massive net margins. Almost for every $1 that you're giving to Coke or you're paying to Coke, 25 of that goes to net profit. So here's Pepsi. Is Pepsi financially world-class? Well, it was down for a few years at a 3, but now it's back up to ranking of a 2. And here we can see that Pepsi's margins are half of Coke, but still the average net margin is 6% globally. So I would say that Pepsi is still in a very good position. Is your company financially world-class? Just message me and I'll score your company. Don't worry, I won't announce it on the YouTube. Let's look at the value. If I look at my free cash flow calculation here, I see a pretty steady rise in free cash flow from about 9,554 million in 22 up to about 12 billion in 2027. And here is my discounted cash flow analysis. I'm using a cost of equity of 10% and a weighted average cost of capital of 8% and about a 3% terminal growth rate. And I would say that the company is fairly valued. Not expensive, but not super cheap. On a PE basis, the PE is 21 times for 2023 versus the sector average for the US at 19 times or so. And Pepsi has a little bit more growth this year. So you could argue that it's about fairly valued. And when we look at price to book, well, price to book is quite high. Typically, for big companies like this that have bought back shares, their equity value is really low. And that also means that the ROE is about 51%. What is your company worth? Message me and let's discuss the value of your company.